the pantheon of games that let you control big, badass mechs, Armored Core is a name that gets brought up quite a bit, but this is a franchise that I have next to no experience in whatsoever, until today, that is. I'm so unaware of what Armored Core truly is that I have barely ever seen any gameplay from any of the games. To be honest though, I haven't got much experience with many mech games in general, even though I'm a huge fan of the entire genre. Zone of the Enders is really the only other game that puts you into the seat of a cool mech that I've played, and I plan on making a proper video for that game at some point in the future. Anyway, I've tried to play Armored Core in the past, but with so many games in the franchise on 5th, 6th, and 7th generation consoles, it's hard to know where the best starting place is. There are so many different opinions on which game would be the best to start with, so after reading through a couple of forums, I settled on trying out Armored Core 9breaker first. And no, I have no idea why this was the one I settled on. I think it just caught my attention somehow, and so I decided to go with it. I did not enjoy my time with it at all, safe to say. I found the controls weird, the premise boring, and didn't spend longer than 10 minutes with the game in total. I'm not entirely sure why I reacted to it so negatively though, especially since it's not so different from the game I'm talking about today. It could just be the classic case of wrong time, wrong place, and I think you've really got to be in the mood to try something like this that really takes you out of your comfort zone. Or at least that's the case for me. But really, I should have just listened to myself and gone with my usual rule for most franchises: start with the first game and work yourself up from there. And I really do think that this is what I'm going to stick to in the future, because if I had, I'd probably have gotten to these games a lot sooner. Which takes us to today's video, where I talk about my first proper experience with an Armored Core game. And I'm happy to say that I think I finally understand what makes these games so good. Now, a few rules before I get into the video. The first and only rule, there will be no mention of this game right here. Not a single one. This entire thing, this thing right here, has no bearing on the rest of the stuff that we're talking about in this video. There's no bearing. It's not going to be mentioned. I don't want to see anyone mention this game in the comments. We're moving on. From Software is not just this. They do other things. That's good. That's good. If I do somehow manage to mention this, I don't know, I'll go get a real job or something instead of talking video games on the internet. Armored Core puts you right in the seat of an Armored Core. Be prepared to hear those two words a lot in this. The player character is known as a Raven. These are what pilots of Armored Cores are called, but it's essentially a fancy word for mercenary with a big death machine holding a 10-ton shotgun. Ravens go out and get jobs for various corporations and entities and use the earnings to soup up their mech for the next big mission. It's a never-ending cycle of destruction and combat, which couldn't possibly be an overarching theme of the game, could it? Since we're touching on the story, I'll just get this out of the way now. Armored Core does not exactly have an engrossing narrative. It doesn't waste time giving you any characters with backstories, dreams, goals, ambitions, or villains with grand goals of world domination. There's barely a through line of instigating events that gives the player character a reason for being the player character. In fact, when you boot Armored Core up, this happens.
System engaged.
Within 10 seconds of starting the game, you are already fighting off two enemies that can pretty easily take you out if you don't know what you're doing, which would be an easy mistake to make since this game has no tutorial of any kind. Armored Core comes from the good old days when you'd need to actually read the manual to understand how to play the game that you just bought, which makes a lot of sense because you're about to be piloting a literal mech. It's like the one time a manual feels congruent with the game. It's actually pretty cool. Throwing the player into the deep end like this is certainly ballsy, but sometimes there's no better way to learn than with a trial by fire. It also does a fair bit of heavy lifting for the narrative, since it sets up how cold and cutthroat being a Raven is in the world of Armored Core. You either risk your life and rake in the big bucks, or die trying. The latter is something you're likely to do a lot of in Armored Core. If I haven't made it very clear so far, this game is hard. First, you have a pretty tricky control scheme to get your head around. Armored Core features full 3D movement, with you being able to move your mech forward and back, side to side, and in all 4 diagonal directions. You also get to move the camera around in these 8 directions too. Add the buttons for using both of your arm weapons and back weapons, and we're using every button that the PlayStation controller has. With the default control scheme, L1 and R1 control your left and right movement, while L2 and R2 look up and down. Then forward and back on the D-pad controls that movement with your mech, while left and right let you turn in those directions. It's hard to stay centered on targets with these controls, but your need to be accurate is mitigated by the lockbox. This is a bounding box in the center of the screen that locks onto enemies automatically as long as they are within it. The size and shape can differ depending on the weapon and the FCS you have equipped. This reticle essentially gives you a much wider margin for error, and it feels really good to use. It suits the style of Armored Core's gameplay perfectly, and I don't think a standard reticle system would have worked here at all. In practice, it's hard not to feel that these controls are extremely clunky, but at the same time, I feel like that's the exact sort of feeling Armored Core wants you to be aware of. The Armored Cores themselves are giant hulking mechs that feel like they have a lot of weight behind them, and the controls simulate that feeling pretty damn well. At the start, you're bound to be pretty shit at controlling your mech and doing what you need to do, but I couldn't help but feel like the pro tag of a mecha show who's thrust into a cockpit and forced to learn how to control this completely new thing on the fly. And for the ultimate sense of retro immersion, I used the PlayStation controller that came with the PlayStation Classic, since it has a handy little USB. Just plug it in and you can use it on your PC. After this video, it's going to go back into the realm of darkness and the void of time known as my drawer, until I let it out one more time to see the sun once again. What was I saying? Anyway, yeah, I say that the ACs are weighty, and that's absolutely the case, but you've got a lot of control over how the Armored Cores actually play. If you've heard anything about this franchise in the past, it's probably about how robust the series customization is. And oh my god, it somehow feels like people generally undersell that fact. You are able to customize every single part of your AC, with each component having its own set of positives and negatives. It's no good just buying the most expensive part in each category and expecting it to perform the best. You actually need to study each part available and think about the sort of build that you want. I generally prefer mechs that are fast and fluid, but able to still take a beating to account for the attacks that I can't quite dodge. And Armored Core let me make that exact sort of thing. But really, this game lets you make practically any kind of mech you can think of. You can make something that's even lighter and faster and spec it towards something that's more melee focused. Or you could go in the opposite direction and make something slow with an arsenal of weapons ready to take out anything that crosses your path. Armored Core balances the sheer amount of freedom you have while trying to communicate to the player that you can't just throw random parts together and expect to have a game-breaking AC. This system does require you to know what you're doing to some extent, or at least be able to learn from mistakes and course correct your AC when certain components are dragging the performance down. For example, each component has its own weight and energy value, and if you start chucking on heavy components onto your AC, you'll need to use legs with a higher weight capacity to support it. And when the energy requirements start to rise, you'll need a better generator that can output more energy. If either your mech is too heavy or doesn't have enough energy to power its systems, then you can't actually take it out on missions. Frankly, I'm still pretty green when it comes to understanding how all of these systems work together and in tandem with each other. In fact, it can be very overwhelming at the start to understand what every statistic means and how it actually contributes to the gameplay. but FromSoft has really tapped into something special here. Half of the fun of Armored Core is looking through all of these menus and figuring out how to upgrade your AC with the funds at your disposal. And sometimes these choices really are gated by how much money you have. When shopping around, you may have to buy a cheaper component to help you get through a few missions in the short term, to then be able to save up more money for a proper upgrade down the line. I really can't overstate how deep customization is. I even got to alter my AC's color scheme to be the same as Ava Unit 1 from Evangelion. Take a guess at what my favorite mech show is. But beyond these simple bipedal designs, you've got reverse-facing legs, quad legs, and treads, and then for arms, you can choose to replace rudimentary hands for massive chain guns and laser rifles, and then you've got an array of arm weapons, including machine guns, plasma rifles, energy swords, and then back weapons like missiles and grenade launchers. The sheer amount of hardware you have to choose from is staggering, and I'd be lying if I said I tried most of what Armored Core has to offer. There is just so much here to choose from that makes experimentation so much fun. Again, half the fun in Armored Core is staring at all of the options you have and trying to work out what would be best for your AC and playstyle, and you may not always make the best choices. Some of my favorite moments in my playthrough came from frustrating moments I had where I just could not complete a level with my current AC loadout. And then, after tweaking some things around and swapping some things out, I was able to head back in and finally win the day. It felt amazing to do. Armored Core is not an easy or simple game though, and I mean that in more ways than one. The controls are awkward to adjust to, the missions can be difficult to accomplish, and the customization gives you so many options that it's all too easy to make a big mistake and struggle without really understanding why. Part of the experience is understanding that that's what you're signing up for, and that can be really satisfying in its own right. But it's also very easy to imagine someone messing up and making all the wrong decisions and leaving the game feeling annoyed and unsatisfied. What makes the game even more punishing is how it deals with failure. At the end of every mission, you get an income and expense report. This details how much money you made from the job, as well as how much it'll cost to repair your AC and refill the ammunition that's been used up. You can also get money deducted from this report if you violated certain requirements in a few missions. For example, if you let some allied units be destroyed in battle, you can expect to see some money deducted from your report. Now, if you end up failing a mission with your AC being destroyed, you'll still get the report card. However, you'll also get no reward and will have to pay for the damages sustained to the AC. If your credits runs down to 0, you'll start being in the negatives for money and won't be able to buy anything until you make that money back, as well as the money needed to actually buy stuff. If you go under minus 50,000 credits, you enter something called the Human Plus program, which essentially gives you a cybernetic upgrade that can do things like give you a sword beam projectile on melee attacks. It's there to give struggling players a helping hand when things keep going wrong. When you lose in Armored Core, that loss is very apparent, and it can make the climb to unlock better upgrades a real chore. But whenever you fail a mission, there's a chance that it outright disappears from the mission list, which is really annoying when you gear up to take another crack at something and it's suddenly gone. From here on out, I'm making sure to save before every level so I can just go back and try again that way. I understand that FromSoft did this to make loss feel realistic and apparent, but it's honestly more annoying that I missed out on a bunch of content without really realizing it. At this point, we are 26 years removed from when Armored Core first released, and with that, it's likely that you'd see some rust starting to show. But I'm shocked at just how well the game holds up by today's standards. I don't want to harp on the game's age too much because it doesn't really matter at all. But I do think that FromSoft needs to be commended for just how structurally sound this game is from top to bottom. After I got used to the controls, I really did feel like I was starting to form some kind of connection to my AC, which led me to understanding how it controlled a lot more. There's tons of little micro movements and actions I started doing to help better position myself to land certain attacks and dodge enemy fire that I couldn't fathom doing in the first couple of hours. And I think that's testament to how engaging Armored Core's control scheme actually is. It takes some getting used to, but once you do, I think the general game feel is brilliant. It's also nice how little time the game wastes into throwing you into the core loop. It would have been nice to have some kind of tutorial for players that needed that helping hand, but it's also refreshing to just be able to play the game and start messing with your AC within the first half hour or so. As I mentioned before, this could be seen as a negative considering how overwhelming all of these systems can seem. So I suppose it depends what you want from a game like this at the end of the day. If you want a game that lets you throw yourself right into the action, then that's exactly what you're getting here. But that does somewhat come at the cost of an engaging narrative, because I'll be honest, I just couldn't really care about anything that was going on. The best thing we've got for any sort of storyline comes in the form of these short mission briefings that you can read at the start of each mission. They give you some context for what's about to take place, and why it's about to happen. But it's really just flavor text to help you understand what's going on. Take this mission briefing for example. The gang Dark Soul... anyway. In a way, the bare bones narrative actually becomes the point of the storyline. After a while, I didn't find myself questioning what was happening in the story much, like the way I'd assume my character might not have. I only cared about getting through the next mission so I could continue to upgrade my AC. And I'm not sure that sort of feeling was necessarily intentional on From Software's part, but either way, it proves to be effective. I do have a few nitpicks that I would like to mention though. A lot of Armored Core's missions take place in tunnels that all look the same, and when you have an objective that requires you to explore every nook and cranny to find certain objects or enemies, it's easy to get lost and have no idea where you're supposed to go. Not to say that it's impossible to figure it out, you're just likely to have a few moments of confusion where you try to decipher which way down the corridor you just came from. The scale of some levels is impressive, there is no denying that. I particularly love one of the missions that comes near the end of the game called Mop Up Chrome Remnants. It has you exploring a vast underground base and ends on the surface in this big field at sunset. Times like these are when Armored Core really impresses with its visuals, but it makes the parts of the game that are a bit ugly and hard to navigate stand out more. On the gameplay side of things, I also feel like the camera has a very hard time in keeping up with the action. For the most part, it's fine once you learn its quirks, but in fast-paced battles, it was just way too slow for me to be able to see what was actually going on. This makes fights against high-ranking ACs a toss-up of who can land their stream of bullets enough times to kill the other mech first. The camera speed could be affected by certain Armored Core parts, so if that is the case, then you can ignore this complaint. In my time though, through the campaign, I couldn't see any way to make the camera behave dramatically better. The only other major complaint I have with Armored Core is From Software's bizarre decision to add some segments that require very delicate platforming. I am sorry, but this is not the kind of game where making minor movements and calculated jumps is easy or good enough to work for these kinds of levels. Armored Core is at its best when you're fighting other mechs or navigating large environments where the full mobility of the AC can be used without fear of failure. Having missions that can be failed so easily because you very fairly couldn't land your jump correctly and fell to your doom is just bad. If Armored Core decides to do these kinds of levels again in the future, I really hope that it has good enough controls to support it. Otherwise, I'm sorry, but those levels are going right into the bin without hesitation. But apart from a few awkward design decisions here and there, Armored Core is a staggeringly solid experience from beginning to end. And even though I would want a lot of tiny things added or improved, it doesn't take away from the fact that this is a very good title. It is on the shorter side though, it took me around 6 hours to beat the game. In fairness, I died in quite a few missions early on, so I guess I accidentally skipped a lot of content. So maybe the playtime could be bumped up to 7 or 8 hours on the first time through, but I'm not entirely sure. If you want to reach 100% completion, then obviously that will add in quite a few hours to the general playtime. It really does just depend on how much of Armored Core 1 you want to see. Personally, I feel pretty satisfied with where I left the game off, so I doubt I'll be diving back into Armored Core 1 anytime soon. If, like me, you weren't sure about whether Armored Core would be for you, then I'd have to say you need to just dive in and check these games out. I'd personally recommend that you start here, and if the PS1 visuals and gameplay aren't quite doing it for you, maybe move up a game and see how you feel. I can attest to these games feeling pretty overwhelming at first, but just head in and see if you like what's on offer. Next up is Armored Core 2. I know that technically Project Phantasm and Master of Arena is next, as they were sort of expansions to Armored Core 1, but I'm going to give those a pass for now for various reasons. I'm just going to move on to Armored Core 2 and see how that treats me. I'm definitely on board the Armored Core hype train now, so I am very excited to see where these next few games take me. I'm excited. Anyway, until then, see you next time.